Professor Brandt, thank you very much for coming to see and visit UNC today. You're one of America's most prolific historians. You have written many books, often biographies, and you have just finished a book on Ronald Reagan. Let me ask you, was Ronald Reagan a great president?
Disaster. Ronald Reagan was a great president in the sense of having a very large impact on the United States and on the world. Was Reagan the sole agent of this change? No. But when we judge presidents, when we judge leaders, we usually judge what was the outcome of their time in office. And if you compare the United States and the world in 1981 to the United States and the world in 1989, or carrying it even a little bit forward as events that began in Reagan's presidency unfolded into the early 1990s, the change is dramatic. The change is, I would have to say, great. Communism had essentially fallen on the ash heap of history. The American domestic political economy had taken a sharp turn to the right. After 50 years of liberalism, starting in the 1930s, all of a sudden the United States moved into the age of conservatism, an age that we remain in today. So it's really hard to look at the Reagan years and not conclude that great things happened. Great in the sense of large things happened. Now, one of the striking things about Reagan, the presidency, is that it is still hotly debated. So for those people who insist on great meaning great and good, you'll get a lot of dispute there. Some people say yes, some people say no. But if you say, were there big changes in the United States and the world during the Reagan years, nearly everybody would say yes.
Thank you, but should we really give credit to Ronald Reagan himself?
This is the conundrum. How important are individuals in history? And the answer is they matter. Are they decisive? Sometimes, but not always. And one of the reasons that there are historians like you and me is we get to continue debating these. So how important was Ronald Reagan in all of this? Or to put the question alternatively, if it hadn't been Reagan, if it had been somebody else, if Jimmy Carter had been elected to a second term, would things have turned out the way they did? I would say that over the long term, yes. I happen to think that the Soviet model was broken, and it would have broken down finally sooner or later. But there were a lot of people who thought if the Soviet Empire falls apart, say as of 1985, the Soviet Empire falls apart in the next 10 years, they thought it's going to be violent. There will be a civil war in Russia. That didn't happen. That was partly Reagan's doing. It was partly the doing of the elder George Bush. It probably had something to do with the fact that the Soviet system had lost its energy. It had just run out of gas. So,
of course, the protest movements in Eastern Europe.
The protest movements, yes. And so this actually raises that question. Does history work from the bottom up or from the top down? And it's a great subject for debates among historians. It's a great topic for essay questions for students. But like most interesting questions in human affairs, the answer is it's some of both. And so there is decision-making that works its way from the top down. There are forces that work their way from the bottom up. Neither Reagan nor George Bush was the one who brought the protesters to the Brandenburg Gate in November of 1989. That was a mass movement. So there were lots of people involved there. If you go back earlier in American history, the civil rights movement of the 1960s was the work of thousands and thousands of people. But at a critical moment, somebody has to make a decision. Somebody has to give the order to fire or not to fire in Berlin. Somebody has to, ultimately, if the President of the United States, sign the Civil Rights Bill or not, guide it through. So history is this collection of efforts from lots of people and from some identifiable people.
So we can say that Ronald Reagan did not win the Cold War.
I would say that the values that Reagan stood for won the Cold War. If that puts Reagan on the winning side, and you're inclined to credit Reagan, you can say, yeah, he won the Cold War. You would be utterly wrong to say he won it by himself. And I think it would be misleading to say that, therefore, Mikhail Gorbachev lost the Cold War. It often seemed during the Cold War that this was a zero-sum game. What was a gain for the United States was a loss for the Soviet Union. But Reagan didn't believe that. Reagan believed that humanity could advance. And Reagan would have said, he did say, that the end of the Cold War was a net gain for Americans, But it was a net gain for the people who had lived in the Soviet Union and the countries under Soviet control, because they came out freer, eventually they came out wealthier, they came out better off. And this was a fundamental belief of Reagan, that the values that America stands for are good for everybody.
Thank you. You write, or you have written a lot of biographies. Biographies still sell. If any history book sells, it usually is a biography. But is writing biographies, reading biographies, doing biographies, is that still appropriate? Isn't the world too complex to explain the world with the help of one or two people?
If one believes that in writing a biography, even of such an important character as Reagan, or pick your great figure from the 20th century, Mao Zedong, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, if you think that that is the only way to do history, then you're misleading yourself and you're misleading your readers. I happen to believe that there are lots of ways of doing history. Biographies have their place. Social histories, histories of classes, histories of technological innovations have their place. History, the history of the human race, is a very complicated endeavor. And there are various ways of getting a handle on this. In various times, I talk about the distinction between little history and big history, the history of individuals and the history of large movements. Most of what happens in the world is a combination of these. In some cases it trends more toward the big, in some cases toward the small. But it's sometimes an unsatisfactory answer for those, say, academic debaters or people who want it to parse it out this or that. One of the things that draws me to history is that we don't have to come up with either or. We get to have it all sorts of ways. The principle of parsimony in explanation suits the sciences. I don't think it suits history, because if we can multiply causes, I think we get closer to the actual thing than if we single them out. Occam's razor is fine for physics. I don't think it works in history.
So your next book will be not a biography?
No, but in fact my next book is going to be, it's going to feature individuals. And I guess, I haven't told anybody else yet, but I'll tell you here, that it's going to be about Harry Truman and Douglas MacArthur and the controversy that developed between those two at the height of the Korean War. And it is going to be, and this is just my literary and historical taste, I find it easier to relate history through individuals, because individuals speak, individuals think. And when I write my history, I like my readers, as I like my students, to hear the voices of individuals. And it's hard to hear the voice of a class, but you can hear the voice of individuals. But this is one, it's not going to be the lives of these people, it's this particular moment.
Right. Thank you. We will keep that secret.
Good. All right.
Ronald Reagan is often referred to, particularly, of course, by Republicans, by conservatives, as a role model for the presidency, as a role model for any American president. Would you agree with that? And if not, in total, what can we take from Ronald Reagan's presidency which may serve as a bit of a role model for any future president, be it a Democrat or Republican?
I would agree that Ronald Reagan is a role model, not the role model, but a role model for a successful presidency. But I would also say that what I have in mind of this, and I think it's more accurate than those people who often cite him, they misunderstand Reagan. Reagan was a combination of a very conservative rhetorician, someone who presented this conservative view, this conservative vision, but at the same time a very pragmatic political leader who understood that you couldn't get to heaven at one leap. It had to go by small steps, and each step in the right direction was a step worth taking. Reagan understood that the point of getting elected was to govern, and not simply to score political points. So Reagan was in favor of tax cuts as a general principle. But when a deal with Congress required increasing taxes, when, for example, he helped reform the tax code in 1986, when he came up with not a cure, but a big improvement in Social Security in 1983, he agreed to tax increases. Those people who often cite Reagan as a role model for the presidency overlook that pragmatic part of Reagan. To me, Reagan demonstrates that successful presidents have to have a vision The vision, if it's going to be successful, has to be consistent and easily articulated. But they cannot hold the practice of their office hostage to the vision. The vision is something they aim for, but today and tomorrow they go in that direction in small incremental steps.
So the lesson would be flexibility plus focus.
Yes, that's put it very well. I would say vision plus pragmatism.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for your insights.
Thanks for having me. This is great.
You.